The dry pine spokes of the wagon wheel shrieked a violent warning before the axle snapped, pitching the wooden cart violently sideways against the sharp limestone ledge. Hannah Vance slammed against the rough pine railing, her breath knocked clean from her lungs as 35 silver dollars tumbled from her leather satchel and scattered down the canyon slope like loose teeth. Below her, the narrow mountain trail dropped 50 feet into the sun-baked granite shadows of Dead Man's Ridge, and the frightened draft horse kicked wild in its harness, pulling the lurching wagon closer to the edge. If the rear iron-rimmed wheel slipped another 3 inches over the crumbling shale, everything she owned and her very life would plunge into the abyss. Hannah did not scream. She did not allow herself the luxury of panic. With white-knuckled fingers, she grabbed the wooden brake lever, digging her heel into the floorboards as she threw her body weight backward to counter the tilt. The sharp smell of hot iron horse sweat and crushed mountain cedar filled the thin, scorching air of the Texas hill country. For 3 agonizing seconds, the wagon hung suspended in the swirling dust, swaying like a pendulum between survival and disaster. Grasping the leather reins with bleeding palms, Hannah spoke to the shuddering gelding in a low, unwavering voice, a calm cadence taught to her years ago by her late grandfather, Thomas Vance. Slowing her own racing pulse through sheer force of will, she coaxed the animal back onto solid earth until the cart groaned and settled firmly against the dirt bank. She leaned her forehead against the damp neck of the horse, feeling the heavy thud of its heart match her own. She was back in Cypress Creek Crossing, and the frontier had already made its opening move. It was October 1884. After 4 exhausting days on the trail from the railhead, Hannah had finally reached the Edwards Plateau. The land stretching before her was both magnificent and brutal, a vast expanse of golden buffalo grass, stark white limestone cliffs and distant purple hills, baking under the Texas sun. Yet behind the majestic scenery lay a harsh, unforgiving reality. A relentless 2-year drought had crippled the territory. Small homesteaders were fleeing, sold-out properties were being bought for pennies on the dollar, and the earth itself seemed baked into brittle clay. Her destination sat atop a barren plateau, known locally as Wickham Ridge, 72 acres of rocky pasture that had once belonged to her grandparents, Thomas and Nora Vance. Since Thomas's passing 3 years prior, the ranch had sat abandoned. The pine cabin's porch had sagged under the heat, the hand-dug well had run bone dry, and the local cattlemen spoke of the ridge as nothing more than a graveyard for broken dreams. Hannah patched the broken wagon axle with a length of seasoned hickory wood and heavy baling wire from her canvas trunk. She gathered her scattered silver dollars from the dirt, straightened her dust-caked wool skirts, and led the limping horse down into the small settlement of Cypress Creek Crossing to secure basic provisions. The town consisted of a single dirt street lined with hitching posts, a noisy saloon, a blacksmith's forge, and the local feed and supply store. As Hannah tied her horse outside the general store, the heavy, deliberate thump of leather boots announced the arrival of the valley's most powerful figure. Garrett Blackwood reined in his massive bay stallion at the wooden hitching rail. At 38 years old, Blackwood was the undisputed cattle baron of the region, owner of the sprawling Blackwood outfit that stretched across tens of thousands of acres on the fertile valley floor. He was a broad-shouldered man with sun-cured skin, ice-blue eyes, and a formidable reputation built on iron-willed pragmatism. Blackwood watched Hannah step onto the wooden boardwalk, his sharp gaze taking in her dusty boots, her mended clothes, and the quiet, immovable dignity in her posture. "You're Thomas Vance's granddaughter," Blackwood said, his deep voice carrying easily across the quiet street. It was an observation, not a question. "Word reached the valley you were coming back. You're wasting your time, Miss Vance. Wickham Ridge is dead. The earth up there turned to ash 2 summers ago, and even the timber wolves have moved on." Hannah stopped on this boardwalk, turning her head to meet his gaze directly without flinching. "Mend your own fences, Mr. Blackwood. The land belongs to my family, and I intend to work it." Blackwood let out a low, dry chuckle, though his eyes remained intently fixed on her. "Work it with what? You can't graze cattle on dry rock, and you don't have the capital to dig a deep shaft." "Then I'll find another way," she replied quietly. She turned into the store, leaving Blackwood sitting high in his saddle. He didn't ride off immediately. Instead, he lingering on the street, watching the wooden door close behind her with an uncharacteristic flicker of intense curiosity behind his stern expression. He had expected a naive city woman who would run at the first sign of hardship. Instead, he had looked into eyes that held the same stubborn flint as the limestone hills above them. Inside the store, Hannah spent nearly all her remaining silver on a decision that would soon make the townsfolk whisper in sheer disbelief. Rather than buying cattle, which required lush pasture and massive quantities of water, she purchased a neglected flock of 200 Angora goats from an itinerant livestock trader. They were lean, ragged animals that no cattleman wanted, led by a massive battle-scarred buck named Barnaby. To the cattlemen of Texas, goats were a nuisance. To Hannah, who knew the value of their silky mohair fleece and their ability to thrive on rugged terrain, they were a lifeline. That evening, Hannah drove her 200 goats up the winding trail to Wickham Ridge. She unpacked her trunk inside the dusty homestead cabin. In the corner of her grandfather's old oak desk, she found what she had truly come back for, a leather-bound geological journal filled with Thomas Vance's meticulous handwriting. While others saw only surface dirt, Thomas had spent decades studying the subtle language of the land. Hannah sat by the flickering light of an oil lamp, flipping through the yellowed pages until her eyes landed on an entry dated 15 years earlier. The West Ridge holds moisture deep within the stone fissures. The topsoil bakes dry, yet the deep limestone breathes. When the sun cooks the earth, the animals always wander toward the western ledge. They feel what the eye cannot see. Hannah looked out the small cabin window into the moonlit night. Outside, the 200 Angora goats were supposed to be bedding down near the barn. But as she watched, she noticed a strange, persistent pattern. Despite the dry wind blowing from the north, the entire flock slowly rose and drifted toward the high, chalky limestone ledge on the far western edge of the property. They didn't gather around the dry wooden well. They didn't huddle near the cabin. All 200 animals moved with quiet purpose, settling their bodies directly against the cracked rock face of the western cliff. Hannah pulled her heavy wool shawl tight around her shoulders and walked out into the cool night, her boots crunching on the dry shale. She knelt among the sleeping goats and pressed her bare palm against the cold stone ledge. Deep beneath the surface, beneath 80 feet of solid rock, she felt a faint rhythmic vibration, like the distant hidden pulse of the earth itself. Her grandfather had been right. The land wasn't dead. It was merely hiding its blood. But as she stood up, the distant sound of horse hooves echoed up the trail from the valley below, signaling that Garrett Blackwood was riding through the dark toward her ridge. The sharp metallic clatter of the horse's hooves echoed off the limestone ledge long before the rider crested the hill. Hannah remained standing by the dry stone face, her fingers still resting against the cool, vibrating rock. She did not flinch as Garrett Blackwood reined in his bay stallion at the perimeter of the crumbling timber fence. In the silver moonlight, the massive horse snorted its hot breath, pluming in the crisp autumn air. Blackwood sat high in his leather saddle, his dark wool coat pulled tight against the mountain draft, his eyes sweeping over the quiet, huddled shapes of the 200 Angora goats gathered against the western cliff. "You're up late, Miss Vance," Blackwood said, his deep voice cutting cleanly through the rustle of dry buffalo grass. "Or are you just guarding a pile of rocks?" "I'm getting acquainted with what's mine." "Mr. Blackwood," Hannah replied, her voice steady and low, "and wondering why the most powerful rancher in the valley feels compelled to ride 3 miles up a broken trail at midnight." Blackwood let out a quiet breath, resting his leather-gloved hands on the saddle horn. "I didn't come to trouble you. I came because I saw your lantern from the valley floor, and I know what this mountain does to people who don't respect it. My grandfather settled this basin 50 years ago. I've watched 3 generations of hard men break their backs on Wickham Ridge. Your grandfather was a good man, Hannah, but he was a dreamer. He died holding onto a piece of dirt that couldn't feed a jackrabbit." Hannah took a step toward the fence line, the hem of her heavy wool skirt brushing through the dry sagebrush. "My grandfather was an observer, Mr. Blackwood. There's a difference. He knew every crack in this limestone. He knew where the water went when the surface dried up." Blackwood leaned forward, the leather of his saddle groaning under his weight. "Water? There hasn't been a drop of water on this ridge since the summer of '82. The creek beds are bone dry, and the river 3 miles down is running at a trickle. If you're banking on finding a spring up here, you're chasing ghosts. You'll be broke before the first snowfall, and those 200 goats will be horse meat for the winter." There was no malice in his voice, and that was what caught Hannah off guard. It was not the arrogant cruelty of a land grabber. It was the unyielding conviction of a man who believed he was saving a foolish woman from her own ruin. Yet as Blackwood looked down at her, his stern, weathered features softened just an inch. He took in the resolute set of her jaw, the dark circles of fatigue beneath her eyes, and the quiet dignity that seemed to anchor her to the earth. For a brief, silent moment, the battle-hardened cattle baron looked at her, not as an obstacle, but as a force he couldn't quite fathom. "I appreciate the warning," Hannah said softly, meeting his gaze without stepping back. "But I'm not leaving. Tomorrow morning I'm hiring Silas in his steam rig." Blackwood straightened instantly, his brows knitting together in genuine shock. "Silas, the drill hand from the junction, Hannah, that man charges $5 a foot, water or no water. You'll spend every silver dollar you have left on a hole in the dirt." "Then it will be my hole in the dirt," she answered. Blackwood stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He opened his mouth to argue, to command to use the authority that had governed Cypress Creek Crossing for 2 decades. But the words died in his throat. The sheer iron will in her eyes silenced him. With a slow, reluctant shake of his head, he turned his stallion around. "Don't say the valley didn't warn you, Miss Vance," he muttered, though his tone carried a strange, grudging respect that lingered long after the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the night. By sunrise, the valley was awake with the mechanical clatter of Silas's steam-powered drilling rig. Caleb Hayes, a quiet young man with broad shoulders and hands calloused from years of splitting cedar posts, arrived shortly after dawn. Caleb had worked for Thomas Vance as a boy, and out of loyalty to the old man's memory, he brought his own team of draft mules and heavy timber to shore up the rig's base. "Your grandfather always swore by this western ledge, Hannah," Caleb said, tightening an iron bolt on the rig's support beam as coal smoke billowed from the small burner. "The old-timers called him crazy, but I remember him standing right here watching the animals. They always came to this exact spot when the heat hit." "They're here right now, Caleb," Hannah noted, gesturing to the perimeter. All 200 Angora goats had moved as a single unit, refusing to graze on the sparse, dry grass near the cabin. Instead, they sat in a wide, patient circle around the drilling rig, their dark eyes fixed on the trembling limestone beneath them. Barnaby, the battle-scarred lead buck, lay closest to the iron drill bit, his horned head pressed flat against the stone. At 8 o'clock, the heavy iron bit struck the rock with a deafening, rhythmic thump that shook the ground beneath their boots. Clang, clang, clang. With every impact, fine white limestone dust rose into the morning air, coating Hannah's hair and clothes in a fine gray frost. 10 feet, 20 feet. By noon, the drill had pushed 40 feet into the solid crust of the earth, yielding nothing but dry, powdery shale. A small crowd of spectators had gathered along the lower trail. Local hands stood watching from their horses, shaking their heads in quiet pity. Among them, sitting apart from the rest on his bay stallion, was Garrett Blackwood. He didn't speak to his men, nor did he join in their skeptical chatter. His eyes were pinned entirely on Hannah, who stood steadfast beside the mud pit, her face streaked with dust and sweat, refusing to look away from the iron cable. By 4 in the afternoon, the rig hit 60 feet. The steam engine groaned under the immense friction, its iron drive belt screeching as it fought against a layer of dense blue granite. Silas wiped his greasy brow with a rag and looked at Hannah with a grim expression. "We're burning through coal, fast, Miss Vance," Silas shouted over the roar of the boiler, "and your $35 only covers us to 75 feet. After that, the rig stops." Hannah felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Her breath came slow and deliberate as she looked at her small tin box sitting on the wagon seat nearly empty. She looked past the iron derrick toward the valley floor, meeting Garrett Blackwood's distant, watchful gaze. He didn't look triumphant. He looked almost pained, as if watching her fail was costing him something he hadn't anticipated. "Keep drilling, Silas," Hannah commanded, her voice ringing clear over the hiss of steam. "Drill until the money runs out." Clang, clang, clang. 70 feet, 75 feet. The sun began to dip behind the jagged hills of the Edwards Plateau, casting long, bloody shadows across the dry pasture. The drill bit shuddered violently, then suddenly dropped 4 inches into a hollow pocket. The engine screamed as the resistance vanished. Silas scrambled for the kill lever, but before he could touch it, a deep, rumbling groan vibrated through the limestone floor. Not from the machine, but from the depths of the earth itself. The ground beneath their boots trembled. The 200 goats instantly scrambled to their feet, lifting their heads toward the sky. A sudden hiss of cold, pressurized air burst from the borehole, blowing a geyser of white dust 50 feet into the air. Then came the smell, clean, sharp, and rich with the scent of wet slate and deep earth. "Get back!" Caleb shouted, grabbing Hannah's arm. With a thunderous roar, a thick column of crystal-clear water erupted from the hole, smashing through the wooden derrick and cascading down the limestone cliff in a roaring torrent. It wasn't a trickle. It was a pressurized artesian spring, shooting 12 gallons a minute of ice-cold mountain water into the dying sunlight. The crowd of spectators fell utterly silent. Silas stood frozen, his mouth agape, holding his grease-stained hat in his hand. Caleb let out a wild, booming laugh, throwing his arms around Hannah as the cold spray soaked them both to the skin. The 200 goats surged forward, crowding around the newly formed stream as it carved a dark, wet path through the dry buffalo grass. Barnaby plunged his muzzle straight into the rushing water, drinking deeply. Hannah stood in the center of the torrent, the icy water washing the dust from her hands and face. She pulled her grandfather's leather notebook from her coat pocket, opening it to the last blank page. With trembling fingers and a stub of lead pencil, she wrote in firm, clear script, October 14th, depth 78 feet, 12 gallons per minute, the spring lives. Through the veil of mist and spray, Hannah looked toward the trail. Garrett Blackwood sat motionless on his horse, drenched in the golden light of the setting sun. He was no longer looking at the water. He was looking at Hannah, his face pale with awe, his eyes burning with an undeniable, profound reverence that changed the air between them forever. He slowly lifted his hat from his head, a silent salute from the king of the valley to the woman who had conquered the dead mountain. But as Blackwood turned his horse and rode back down into the shadows, Hannah knew that bringing water to the surface was only the beginning. Keeping it in a valley starved for power would be the true war. The morning sun rose over Cypress Creek Crossing, casting a warm amber glow across the limestone cliffs of Wickham Ridge. What had been a dusty, barren plateau just 48 hours prior was now alive with the continuous musical rushing of fresh water. The artesian spring maintained its steady, vigorous surge, filling a series of pine troughs Caleb Hayes and Hannah had hastily constructed during the night. The water spilled over the wooden edges, carving dark, fertile channels through the thirsty soil and turning the dry grass near the western ledge into a bright emerald carpet. News of the strike had spread through the valley like wildfire across the dry prairie. By midday, the quiet trail leading up to the homestead was lined with buckboards and ridden horses. Local homesteaders, men and women whose faces bore the deep, weary lines of a 2-year drought, stood at the fence line in quiet amazement. Ray Decker had driven his supply wagon up from town, carrying extra lumber and iron piping on credit, eager to align himself with the woman who had achieved the impossible. Even Buford Shea, an old weathered cattleman who had openly mocked Hannah's return at the saloon 3 days ago, stepped up to the porch, took off his hat, and offered a gruff, sincere apology before purchasing 2 barrels of fresh water for his ailing milk cows. Yet amid the sudden flurry of attention and praise, Hannah remained focused on the work. She knew that a sudden windfall of water in a starved territory was as dangerous as it was miraculous. As she stood near the newly built catchment basin, hand-feeding a handful of green clover to Barnaby, the battle-scarred lead buck, she heard the slow, deliberate tread of heavy boots on the gravel trail. It was not the sound of a horse. Garrett Blackwood was walking. The valley's most powerful rancher had left his bay stallion tied at the lower gate, choosing to ascend the steep incline on foot. He wore no riding gloves, and his heavy leather coat was unbuttoned, revealing the simple wool shirt beneath. The arrogance that had defined his posture for years seemed to have washed away with the dust, replaced by a quiet, contemplative weight. Caleb Hayes immediately stepped forward, his hand resting instinctively on the handle of his fencing hammer, but Hannah raised a gentle hand to stay him. "It's all right, Caleb," she said softly. "Let him come." Blackwood stopped 10 feet from the spring, his piercing blue eyes taking in the clear stream, the thriving flock of 200 Angora goats, and finally, Hannah herself. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the rush of water and the rustle of the autumn wind through the mountain cedars. "I didn't come to talk about land rights, Hannah," Blackwood began, his voice lacking its usual thunder, sounding instead like gravel shifting underfoot. "And I didn't come to buy your water." "Then why are you here, Mr. Blackwood?" Hannah asked, her gaze steady, though her heart beat with a cautious rhythm. Blackwood reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a rolled, yellowed piece of heavy parchment bound with a faded red ribbon. He held it out toward her. Hannah stepped forward and took it, her fingers briefly brushing against his rough, calloused palm. A subtle warmth passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place since the sun had set the previous evening. Unrolling the parchment, Hannah found a remarkably detailed hand-drawn map of the entire Cypress Creek watershed. It bore the date 1864 and was signed in a fine copperplate script, Garrett Blackwood, age 21. "My father built the Blackwood Empire on brute force," Blackwood said, stepping closer to the edge of the wooden trough and looking down at the crystal-clear water. "He believed you conquered nature by breaking it. When I was a young man, I surveyed this whole valley. I mapped the stone layers, the underground shifts, the way the snow melt traveled through the deep granite. I knew there was a deep pressure shelf under Wickham Ridge. But my father laughed at my maps. He said cattle needed open grass, not geology lessons. So I buried those drawings in an iron box and learned to rule the valley the way he did with cattle fences and pride." He looked at her, then his expression raw with an honesty he had likely never shared with another living soul. "I watched you stand by that drill rig yesterday, Hannah. I saw the way you trusted your grandfather's notes, the way you observed those goats when everyone else saw only useless ridge runners. You didn't try to conquer this mountain. You listened to it. You proved that I've been misreading this valley for 20 years. Hannah looked from the intricate lines on the map to the man standing before her. She saw for the first time not a ruthless cattle baron, but a man who had suppressed his own vision to carry the heavy mantle of his family's expectations. "This map shows the natural fault lines." Hannah noted her eyes tracing a red ink path that ran from her western ridge straight down toward the eastern pastures of both their properties. "If we channel the overflow through the natural limestone fissure here, we won't just water my 72 acres. We can feed a secondary irrigation ditch that reaches the lower valley basin. It could save 6 small homesteads from bankruptcy before the winter freeze," Blackwood said, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of his lips. "Including 3 of my outer pastures, but it requires your permission and your water." "It isn't just my water, Garrett," Hannah replied, using his first name for the first time. "It belongs to the mountain. My grandfather only meant for us to be its stewards." A look of profound relief and deep, undeniable admiration washed over Blackwood's face. He stepped closer, his posture softening as he looked down at her with a warmth that went far beyond mere neighborly respect. "You're a remarkable woman, Hannah Vance. The valley doesn't deserve you, but God knows we need you." He offered his hand not in a cold business transaction, but in a gesture of partnership and unspoken devotion. Hannah took it, feeling the strength and sincerity in his grip. As they stood together by the roaring spring, discussing the timber needed for the eastern irrigation ditch, Caleb Hayes watched from the barn with a quiet, approving nod. The tension that had paralyzed Cypress Creek crossing for years was beginning to thaw. Yet as Hannah looked up at the gathering clouds over the distant hills, she knew that winter was fast approaching. To ensure the survival of her growing homestead and secure her family's legacy permanently, the coming season would require turning this newfound harmony into a lasting foundation. 6 months later, April arrived in the Texas hill country, bringing with it the sweet, damp scent of thawing soil, blooming mountain cedar, and wild clover. The brutal winter that many had feared had come and gone, but Wickham Ridge had not merely survived, it had flourished. The pressurized artesian spring, flowing undiminished at 12 gallons a minute throughout the freezing months, had kept the stone catchment basins clear of ice. The overflow, channeled carefully through the limestone fissures, according to Garrett Blackwood's old survey maps, had transformed the lower valley basin. Where barren, sun-baked clay had once stretched for miles, a vibrant ribbon of emerald green now wound its way through the valley, nourishing the pastures of 6 neighboring homesteads and reviving the drought-stricken eastern fields of the Blackwood outfit. The transformation was nowhere more evident than on the crest of the ridge itself. The original flock of 200 lean, neglected Angora goats had weathered the winter in sturdy timber shelters built by Caleb Hayes and powered by the abundant water supply. With the coming of spring, the flock had yielded its first miraculous dividend, 40. Healthy, snow-white kids were now leaping across the greening hillside, bringing the total count to 240. Barnaby, the battle-scarred lead buck, ambled contentedly along the wooden fence line, his thick mohair fleece glistening like spun silver in the morning sun, as he guided the young kids toward the crystal-clear troughs. On a bright Tuesday morning, a light buckboard carriage climbed the winding trail from Cypress Creek Crossing. Riding inside was Ruth Holsey, a territorial agricultural official sent to inspect the legendary water system that had become the talk of the region. Hannah stood on the porch of the newly restored homestead cabin, wearing a clean linen blouse and a dark wool skirt, holding her grandfather Thomas's leather-bound journals in her arms. Beside her sat her grandmother Nora, wrapped in a warm knitted shawl, her frail hands resting gently over Hannah's fingers. Ruth Halsey stepped off the carriage, her eyes wide with professional admiration as she surveyed the lush pastures, the intricate wooden flumes, and the thriving flock of goats. "Miss Vance," Ruth said, extending a hand in deep respect, "the Territorial Agricultural Board has reviewed the reports on your irrigation methods and your grandfather's soil records. What you've achieved here isn't just a successful homestead, it's a blueprint for the future of Texas settlement. We are officially entering Thomas Vance's journals into the archives as an exemplary model of sustainable land stewardship." Hannah smiled, a deep sense of peace settling over her heart as she looked down at the aged leather cover in her lap. "My grandfather always knew the answers were here, Miss Halsey," Hannah said softly. "He just needed us to listen to what the land was trying to say." As the official completed her inspection and departed, the sound of rhythmic hooves signaled another arrival. Garrett Blackwood rode up the trail on his bay stallion, but he no longer carried himself with the heavy, solitary authority of a distant cattle baron. Over the winter, Garrett had become a constant welcome presence on Wickham Ridge. He dismounted smoothly and walked up to the porch, removing his hat with a gentle smile that was reserved for Hannah alone. "The wool buyer from St. Louis arrived in town this morning, Hannah," Garrett said, his deep voice rich with satisfaction. He took one look at the mohair fleece samples Caleb brought down and offered top dollar for the entire spring clip. He said he hasn't seen staple wool of that quality anywhere in the territory. "That's wonderful news, Garrett," Hannah replied, stepping down from the porch to meet him by the fence line. "Caleb and the hands are setting up the shearing pens by the lower barn this afternoon." Garrett looked at her for a long, quiet moment, his blue eyes filled with an enduring warmth and profound devotion. He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing the smooth back of her palm. "I was talking with Ray Decker at the store," Garrett murmured softly. "We were remembering the day you drove those 200 goats up this mountain with $35 in your satchel and an axle held together by baling wire. Half the valley thought you were out of your mind." "And what did the other half think?" Hannah teased gently, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "The other half was too proud to admit you were the bravest thing that ever happened to Cypress Creek Crossing," Garrett answered earnestly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Including me." There was no longer any shadow of rivalry or doubt between them. Their shared work on the watershed had blossomed into a deep, steady love built on mutual respect, shared vision, and an unshakable trust. As Garrett stood beside her, his hand wrapped warm and secure around hers, Hannah knew that the future of the valley was no longer divided between cattlemen and goat herders or between power and desperation. They had built something enduring together, a community bound by the shared life of the spring. As the late afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the valley, Hannah walked up to the high limestone ledge on the western border. Garrett walked beside her, his arm resting comfortably around her waist, while Caleb Hayes leaned against the timber fence below, checking the water gates. Below them, the 200 original Angora goats and their newborn kids grazed peacefully along the lush banks of the stream. The continuous musical murmur of the artesian spring echoed off the ancient stone, carrying the cool, pure blood of the mountain down to the thirsty earth below. Hannah leaned her head against Garrett's shoulder, looking out over the panoramic beauty of the hill country. She realized then that the mountain had never been dead, the soil had never been barren, and her dream had never been impossible. They had simply required someone with the patience to read the hidden marks, the courage to dig through the stubborn stone, and the faith to believe that life would always find a way to burst through the dry places. Standing on the ridge that bore her family's name, surrounded by love legacy and the eternal song of rushing water, Hannah Vance knew she was finally home.